Greetings, class. Professor Jackson here. Continuing on in our discussion about globalization, we've gone from a definition and some conception of globalization, gone over its sort of history, if you will, as a set of increasingly interconnecting nodes of trade across the planet we inhabit. And then we've gone on from describing what globalization is to three different ideologies that have different perspectives on what globalization not is. The definition of it is uncontroversial, right? That we've dealt with so far. What we're talking about in the differences between the three ideologies, and we're going to look at how those three ideologies come into conflict with one another, so that we can track how the global economy and activities within it and different understandings that lead to different policies about globalization can lead to war and terrorism, military conflict more broadly, which is where we're going to end this semester, military conflict, in keeping with the times. And so the three ideologies are not differing definitions of what globalization is. The three ideologies are about what shape globalization ought to take. And part of what shape it ought to take is an answer to the question, whom ought it to serve? Okay? An underlying question to that might be, are you and I, the individuals that inhabit this earth, here for the market, or is the market here for us? So last time we looked at the first ideology of globalization called globalism. Please don't confuse the terms. Globalism, any ISM, feminism, Marxism, capitalism, and so on, are ideologies. And ideologies present comprehensive doctrines, that is a description of the world, and sort of like Plato and Aristotle, right? It gives a description of the world and a prescription, right? Here's the descriptive part, and here's the ethical part, right? One, it talks about, it describes globalization in a particular way, and then says how we ought to behave within it, okay? So globalism is represented, of course, by globalists, and globalists tend to be those people who benefit from the status quo, from a minimally regulated global market, right? And globalism, I almost did it myself, as we saw, has three main claims: that globalization is natural, inevitable, and helps everyone, okay? It's natural in that it happened, right? Inevitable in that the way that we showed the graph of the increasing number of nodes of trade across the globe is inevitable in that if we ran back time and started it over again, basically the same thing would occur. That's the second claim. The third claim is that it helps everyone. And although that may be true, it's not necessarily the case that it is true. But even if that were true, by saying it helps everyone, you're still making a statement that is blind, or rather silent, on the question of distribution. It's sort of akin to saying that because you're an American and the American GDP is high, therefore you are a wealthy person. Incorrect, right? And the reason for that is that gross domestic product, the total amount of economic input of the United States in a year, is a figure that does not reflect distribution. It could be that of 300 million people, one dude has it all. It's going to be a dude. And the rest of us have nothing. So, again, those three claims are ones that you can push back on in your term paper, okay? Perhaps the most startling claim that globalism makes is that markets are self-regulating, right? This is a position known as market fundamentalism. Well, I believe we watched a particular documentary about just how good markets are at regulating themselves. That's the sort of thinking that got us into the Great Recession, right? And perhaps the most sweeping generalization that globalism makes is that morality does not apply to the global market. And that'll be a point of contention in which it differs from the second and third ideologies. The second and third ideologies both argue that that morality does in fact apply to globalization, to the actions and outcomes of the global market. But their methods of redress are rather radically different. Okay? So the first thing I would do to push back against the three main claims is against globalism, is that globalization, the shape of it rather, is neither natural nor inevitable. But after that point, right, especially the point in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, where we're no longer talking about two people on an island anymore trading with one another for fish and yams, we're talking about blocks of hundreds of thousands or even millions of people trading with one another. And at that point, it's no longer this inevitable process that it actually occurs as the result of political choices. And it's at that point that globalization and the market in general begins to show its preference for certain individuals over others. Okay. In order to further a neoliberal, or as we said, market fundamentalist agenda, right, laws need to be enacted in order to make that happen. Okay. Otherwise, how is globalism an ism at all? How is it an ideology? Ideology has at least one main aim, and that is influence namely over policy, or how the rules of the game are set up, okay? It doesn't actually help everyone. In globalization, you can see through the massive wealth inequality. Don't take my word for it, just look it up. Wealth inequality since 1990 has only grown. We have what's now called a K-shaped economy. You can look that up if you wish. But more often than not, the winners are the already powerful, right? And that leaves a vast number of losers, okay? And of course, globalists want minimal regulation because, like the 300-pound football player team against the team of 100-pound pencil necks, they want to be able to use the force of their own physique to win the game rather than having to submit to rules that are imposed by them. Okay? So that's sort of an encapsulation of the first ideology and some pushback against it. The second ideology of globalization, we're going to call the global justice movement. This ideology's adherents are not as monolithic as the globalists are, because they represent an array, a spectrum of different interest groups that have their own critiques of how the actions and results of global trade are treating their particular constituency, be it the whales or children in child labor laws, or indigenous rights, or environmental protections, and so on. Okay, so they're not as monolithic; they're more of a coalition, as it were. Okay, and that coalition basically can be seen as a set of interests. Right? Here's Save the Whales. Here's indigenous rights. Here's child labor laws, and so on. And they all have different orientations, but they converge around a set of ideas that basically call for the reform of the global basic economic order, which we studied under Thomas Poga, so that it's more democratic, so that, not that democracy is an end in itself, democracy is instrumental to deeper interests, right? We want, or rather, excuse me, Poga and the adherents of the global justice movement want democracy, want the GBEO to be democratized so that it is more representative so that it can be more responsive to the plight of the various interest groups that people say are harmed by the actions and outcomes of the global market. Okay, so one metric that is used to judge whether or not actions and outcomes of the global market are harming people is whether or not they violate what are called human rights. When we looked at Thomas Poga, we looked at rights conceptually in general. Human rights are just rights that are held by those simply because they're human. They are the most broadly held group of rights. You can have citizenship rights, by which, even though they're human, a French person cannot vote in a United States election, right, and vice versa. Or you can have membership rights, even though two people are Americans, one person has joined the country club and the other has not, and so only the person who's joined the country club can gain access. Okay. So human rights are a standard by which harms of the global market can be assessed. Morality, of course, does apply. I mentioned Poga already, and the democratization that lies at the cross point of all of these different interest groups that want to have their particular constituencies' harms or interests addressed, right? And essentially, we don't need to look at a new ideology there or look at a new philosophical argument there. We can say that that place of overlap for these various adherents to the global justice movement is represented by Poga's argument, which we've already looked at. Okay? So for global justice movement, in terms of what arguments they advance, just reference Poga in your term paper. Okay? One pushback against that might be, well, look, if we advance the interests of the global poor, are we not simply enabling the existence of more global poor, right? The answer to that is actually found in a study by a philosopher-economist named Amartya Sen, S-E-N, who did a study in the early 2000s, I believe, that showed, by canvassing various populations throughout the world. The first one in the study was in the state of Kerala in modern-day India, where it was shown a corroboration between an increase that showed that as women become increasingly educated, birth rates fall. So the more education women experience, the fewer children they have. Because with education comes life prospects and the ability to lead one's own life in a way that one is able to develop projects other than simply reproducing. And so as populations become better educated, they become less impoverished because there are fewer people produced in poor families. Okay? So that is all I'm going to ask you to be accountable for in your term paper for the second ideology. The third ideology is in a following module. As always, please email me if you have questions. Thanks so much and have a lovely day.